Okay, now I'm going to read these, the first hunk in a second, but the next two episodes in Mark's gospel are both going to relate to the same subject, and they're going to both talk about what is appropriate work on the Sabbath and who gets the right to determine what is appropriate. In this first story, as you'll see in a minute, there isn't any real action that happens. There's no miracle. Jesus doesn't do anything in particular. It's all just discussion. But it is setting up for the next section, which is there's going to be some action in that. But this, and I'll talk in a moment more about why the Sabbath is so important. But I just have to say that the keeping of the Sabbath was one of the things that the Jews had, they were monotheists, which was unusual in the ancient world. In fact, I don't know if you know this, but in Jesus' day, they were considered the atheists of the world because they only believed in one God. Everybody knew there were lots of gods, and the fact that the Jews only worshiped one made them quite outside of what everybody knew was true. And so they were called the atheists. And then the second thing was the Jews followed cleanliness laws. They followed, and as we go on, we've talked about some of them, but they did follow these rules, which in some cases coincided with other cultures, but for the most part, this was a fairly unique thing to the Jews. But the Sabbath was completely unheard of in the ancient world. No other culture divided the year into weeks of 7 days. Nobody did. The Jews did because of the creation story. And the day of rest was unheard of in the ancient world. Now, they had feast days and days of worshiping where they would have a time off and celebrate the emperor, or they would celebrate a god, a certain thing about a god, or they would celebrate a victory or some kind of memory thing. But they didn't have a day once every 7 days where they rested. And this caused all kinds of problems when people interacted with the Jews in the ancient world, because they were just nobody was used to that. You just worked. And remember, a third of the empire, the Roman Empire, were slaves. And so, and it's not slavery like we think of it in the American experience. It's a different form of ownership. I would say the working class, the middle class down were primarily the servants, slaves owned by wealthy people, but they never got a day off. And this whole thing of a day off was just completely unheard of. This was so profoundly important to Jews, this honoring of the Sabbath, because it was part of their ultimate identity. If you look at the Ten Commandments, and in fact, the Ten Commandments, it is one of them to keep the Sabbath. And there is more comment in the passages that tell us about the need to keep the Sabbath in the giving of the law than on any other part of the law. It's so important. So I'll talk more about it, but I just want you to know, as we talk about this, what Jesus is doing is, in these two passages, is that he is crossing lines that the religious leaders cannot even imagine. And as we get more into Sabbath, I'll tell you some more of the restrictions that they had. But let's read this passage, and then I'll tell you more about what's happening here. It says one Sabbath day, and that's like the most important thing, okay? Because what's about to happen wouldn't have mattered any other day of the week, all right? One Sabbath day, as Jesus was walking through some grain fields, his disciples began breaking off heads of grain to eat. But the Pharisees said to Jesus, "Look, why are they breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath?" And Jesus said to them, "Haven't you ever read in the Scriptures what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God during the days when Abiathar was high priest, and broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests are allowed to eat. He also gave some to his companions." Then Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath." Now, as I said, this business about it being the Sabbath day is really important. And the idea was that they were not to what? Work. They were to rest from all of their labors. Now, the question becomes, what is work? You should Google sometime Mishnah, the book Shabbat, and then in that you'll find the 39, there they are, the 39 stratas of working that are not allowed on the Sabbath. Remember, this goes from sundown on Friday night to sundown on Saturday. And so you had to have, when the Sabbath came, you had to have all your cooking done. You had to have everything ready for the next day. You had to have, your life had to be completely ready to do nothing. I've talked about you couldn't walk any farther than about 1,000 yards. It was about a half a mile. I've told you this before, I believe. It's like the distance that God told the Jews to carry the ark when they crossed into the promised land. He said, carry the ark out into the middle of the Jordan River, and then the waters will part. And so they did, and the waters parted, and they crossed into Israel. And that's the distance from where the ark was to the middle of the river was the distance they decided God would allow them to walk on a Sabbath day. So they couldn't walk any more than it was about 1,000 yards. And in fact, the Essenes, that at this time when Jesus was on the earth, were so serious about this that they said that if you even talked about doing any of this stuff during the Sabbath because you were thinking about doing it after the Sabbath, you were breaking the law. So they were so serious about it. There's all kinds of, I would say, fictitious writings about things related to the Sabbath. They had stories, if you read, I think it's in Jubilees. There's this thing in there that says that the angels kept the Sabbath before God made the world. I don't think so. I mean, I just don't think that, but this was part of their world. So just think about this. Carrying. Well, now, then they go, well, what is it to carry something? And so they all get together, all the brainy rabbinical people, and they talk about how much you can carry before it becomes carrying. And see over there where it says, you couldn't drag a stick behind you because you'd be plowing, of course. And where it says harvesting, this is what's the issue now. What had happened was there's a phrase for something that is stipulated by the rabbis that is the law that everybody has to follow, and it's called halakha. And so they were making halakha. And Jesus he's not, when he's talking, he's not saying you have to do this like I'm saying you have to do it as we get into this, but he's the only person really who has the authority to do that. He's the only one that really has the authority to do it. But once things got set down and everybody'd come to terms on what you could and couldn't do, then your life was controlled by this. So anyway, bottom line, most Jews obeyed these laws. To break them was a capital offense. Now, if you broke them, you were given warnings. It took 2 witnesses to testify that you had broken the laws by complete disregard for the Sabbath. But the punishment was stoning. So it's just serious. Now, God did not institute the Sabbath for the purpose of making us live under this kind of bondage, really. He instituted the Sabbath primarily so that we would have balance in our lives, that we would have moments, time to think about him and what it's a thanksgiving, a joy time. You know, they were supposed to every 7th year, they were supposed to have a Sabbath of the land where they didn't even plant anything. They were supposed to save enough through that 6th year and then not do anything, give the land and animals and everything a rest for a year. And then they'd have to live that year and the next one until the plant season. I mean, we're talking 2 years of trusting and being faithful putting faith in God that he was going to take care of us. I mean, and God wanted to have this in there so that our families would be together and we would spend time with our neighbors. And there are all kinds of things that come from the rest. The Sabbath was made for man. But the way that the Jews had gone about it and the reason they did it this way was because they were so certain that if they could keep the laws, if they could keep this one, if everybody would keep this one, then God would see how serious everybody was about serving him and he would send the Messiah and then they would get the kingdom of God would come. This is their initial intentions were completely altruistic. They really were. They just didn't want to offend God. But after a while, the rules become the way that you put control on Suddenly, we are living to make the Sabbath look good. And I'm sure, I grew up in an environment where there were a lot of rules that made no sense to me. And it's interesting because I meet with Jay Height. Do you guys know who Jay Height is? He's the boss man down at Shepherd Community. And he's an old school Nazarene. And so I have these conversations with him, and he tells me where all the rules came from because in the Nazarene church they're still in effect. But it's interesting, when they talk about how we got the rules, it makes perfect sense. But I'll bet you can't find 1 in 10 Nazarenes who know why they don't do those things now. And this is the world that they're living in. Anyway, okay, so on we go. So, it is Jubilees, it said the angels practiced. But the bottom line is this, that anybody who's going to come in the name of God and claim to be a prophet, claim to be the Son of Man, and not keep the Sabbath in a specific manner that made the institutionalized, religious leaders happy, if he wasn't making the establishment happy, then he was going to have all kinds of problems with them thinking he's a real deal. Who on earth could come in the name of God and not keep the Sabbath? So this is what we're working on. And so it says that one Sabbath, Jesus was walking through some grain fields, and his disciples began breaking off heads of grain to eat. Now, it starts out, and it came to pass. So we don't know exactly when this event happened, but the main thing is that it happened on the Sabbath. And Jesus is walking through a cornfield. Corn, they didn't have maize, so the word is cornfield. But it was either barley or wheat. We don't know which one. That doesn't really matter. We also know that Jesus had not walked any farther than about 1,000 yards from wherever he started, because if he had, then he'd have been accused of breaking the Sabbath for walking too far. And the other thing that I can't figure out is, what are the Pharisees doing there anyway, following him around? I don't know. But that detail about the distance is important, because he must have been within his boundaries. And the Pharisees would have never traveled farther than that. What Mark does tell us, and I think that the NLT is right, it says breaking off the heads of grain to eat. So what they're actually doing, and in, where is it? It's in, I think, Deuteronomy 23:25, there's a stipulation that says if you're walking through somebody's field and you're passing by, there it is. When you enter your neighbor's field of grain, you may pluck the heads of grain with your hand, but you must not harvest it with a sickle. In other words, if you're walking through a field and everything's ripe and you want to pull a few off and eat them, you can do this. Now, if this had been Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday afternoon, it wouldn't have mattered at all that they were doing this because they could do it. And the other thing is this, there's only about 6 weeks of the year when the grain is at a position to be edible like this. So you wouldn't do it most of the time, and they wouldn't even be able to do it. It's all in late April, May, harvest was in June. So what they're saying is if you're going through your neighbor's field, and you want to have a snack, go right ahead. Here's the problem. When they pulled the heads off, they're harvesting because it's been determined that you can't do that on the Sabbath. And if they took them in their hands and they rubbed them like this to get the sheath off of the grain to eat the seed on the inside, then they're doing what's called reaping. So they're doing two things right now. They're breaking the law, like terribly breaking the law on the Sabbath. Now, the Greek, where it says, can you put the text, the first verse back up for me? It says his disciples were breaking off the heads of grain to eat. The Greek is really fuzzy here. The Greek it kind of does, but it's confusing. It reads as if they were going through the fields and pulling the whole plant out of the ground. And so some people go, well, what they were doing was making a pathway through the field. And Jesus was walking in front of them, and they're just following him, and they're making a pathway by pulling all the plants out. Now, I think that's kind of crazy, and the truth is this story is also in Matthew, and it's in Luke, and both of them just leave that out. They put the Greek in a manner that there's just no way to get it confused, that they're just picking the heads off. But Mark must have been all worked up, and he's got his Greek kind of weird, and so there's this bit of a thing that they're pulling the whole plants out, but they weren't. Now, it says, but the Pharisees said to Jesus, what are they doing with him on the Sabbath, out on a walk? Now, it could be that they're just being guys who just want to have a conversation with this rabbi. Maybe they're just having a conversation with him. Or maybe they're there to do what? To spy on him. To spy on him. Now it says, look, why are they breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath? The first word in the Greek is behold. Now those of you who might have taken the Genesis class with me, like every time you turn around in Genesis, somebody is starting a sentence with behold, which means everybody take note. Look at this. Can you believe it? Or you're not going to believe it, or something like that. Well, that's exactly what it says. If I would have been translating this, I'd have gone, look, exclamation point. And then why? And now you guys know why they're asking Jesus this. Because the actions of the disciples can all be blamed on the rabbi. There's nothing that disciples would do publicly that most people didn't assume they'd been instructed to do by the rabbi. And so they talk to Jesus. Now, they go, look, hey. And so what it reads like, really, is like, okay, you just picture this. Jesus is walking through the field or on the side of the field. I don't know that he was walking through it, but through the middle of it, but he was like walking by it. And he's just walking ahead, and his disciples are behind him like they're supposed to be good disciples, are following him. And they're picking the grain because they're kind of hungry, and they're maybe hungry, I don't know, but it just looked good to them, so they're doing this. And the Pharisees yell at Jesus, hey, look at what they're doing. Like Jesus doesn't know. It's like, hey, look back there, look what those boys are doing back there. And they go, why are they breaking? And they're just right straight at it. There's no question about it. What do they say? Why are they breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath? Now, okay, if it'd been the Sabbath and they were out there with sickles and they had their donkeys and everything and they were cutting it down and pulling it together and taking it off to thresh it, that's called harvesting grain. What they were doing was nothing like that. And in fact, as I said earlier, they were what? Doing what was legal. It was legal. And in fact, it was so, here's the thing. The reason that God wanted them to be able to do this was because when you go through your neighbor's field and have some of the grain to eat while you're passing through, it's a community moment of joy. You and your neighbor are now sharing in the abundance that God has brought to you as a community. And that's what the point of it was. We all share, we live together here and we share together, and you don't keep from your neighbor a little bit of something. You all share in the wonder of what God is doing for us. And they have lost it completely by this law. Well, Jesus, interestingly, can you put the next bit up for me, Jeff? Jesus answers them like a regular rabbi in a discussion. This thing where he says to them, have you not read in the scripture? Now that phrase was not uncommon in discussions between religious people. It was something you tended to say when you knew that your opponent was completely wrong and knew it. There was a bit of a condescension in it, or a bit of, come on, kind of thing. Here's the deal. There's not a chance that the Pharisees there with Jesus on that afternoon had not read this passage that we're going to talk about. There's not a chance. I mean, these guys are this is their job. They are the people who read the scripture and tell everybody what's going on. And this, what he's going to talk about, is a story related to David. They've read that thing 100 times. He says, haven't you read in the scripture? Now, can you put the other one back, and then we'll go to this for just. It says, what David did when his companions were hungry. Now, everybody there is going to know what Jesus is talking about. What we're about to read is the story that this comes from. So go ahead and put it back up there. This is from 1 Samuel. That's the first 10 verses I'll read. David went to Nob, that's a city, that's not a person, to Ahimelech, the priest. As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever you can find. But the priest answered David, I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women. And then goes on to say, that's all you got? You couldn't get the whole thing? Okay, what he says is I told him not to get around women anyway, so they're all clear about that. And then he said, so the priest goes and he gets these 5 loaves of bread, and he gives them to David, and David goes on. Now that's a story. Now the reason that Jesus brings this up is not because it's got anything to do with the Sabbath. This did not happen on the Sabbath. There is a hint in the scripture that the day that the loaves were set out, so what this is the tabernacle was the tent of meeting for the Jews. This is pre-temple, so the tabernacle is there. It says that Ahimelech was the priest. In the tabernacle was the table for the showbread, they called it. And they would lay out loaves of bread to honor God, and then they would leave them out for a week. Then the priests could eat them, but nobody else was supposed to eat them. You get this? You get what I'm saying? And David comes in and he goes, I need food. And so he says, well, I don't have any food, but I've got these loaves of bread that nobody's supposed to eat but the priests. And David says, give me the loaves. I need the loaves. So you see, David is doing what? David is making a decision about what is appropriate when it comes to the law, because he has the authority to do this. It doesn't have anything to do with Sabbathness. It just has to do with David is a person who has enough authority to do what he thinks is important in the moment. So you following me on this? So Jesus is going to reference the story. So go back up to the regular text for me, Jeff. It says, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God during the days when Abiathar was the high priest and broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests were allowed to eat. He also gave some to his companions. Now, I don't know if you noticed this, but there are some problems here. Are you ready for this? I'm just going to give them to you. First off, nothing in the story that is about David in Samuel ever tells us that he actually had men with him. The story runs that he's on his own and that him saying to the priest that he has men with him is a ruse. And he never has men with him in the story. Okay? And there's no statement anywhere before David goes in there that they're all hungry. He says this. Also, did you notice that the name of the priest in David's story was Ahimelech, and Jesus says it was Abiathar. Abiathar was Ahimelech's son. Ahimelech, the person in the story who gave the loaves to David, is caught by Saul, even though he had no idea what was going on. He just said, I did what I thought. David told me that he was here on a mission from you, Saul, and so I did what he said to do because I thought he was representing you, Saul. And Saul goes, well, he wasn't, and so you and your entire family are to be killed. And they are, and the only person who survives and runs away safely is this Abiathar, who is one son of the priest who escapes. So Jesus names somebody that's different from the regular person. And it never says in the story, ever, that David went into the temple. It says that Ahimelech went into the temple and got them and brought them out to David. Now, I know it's weird that I'm bringing all this up. There are all kinds of explanations. Some of them are really nitpicky Greek things that I just don't even want to talk about. In fact, in your notes, if you read this part, it will say, there are really nitpicky Greek things that I don't want to talk about. And most of it has to do with the fact that, I'm talking about it, that often in ancient texts, they will name the person who is the most well-known person in the whole of the story. And so Abiathar, whom Jesus names, is somebody that everybody knew about. Ahimelech is somebody that was sort of ancillary to the story and had a tragic end, and Abiathar plays a big part, and so it's sort of like in the days of Abiathar kind of thing, though it's not really, this didn't happen when he was just a son of the priest. Other people say, well, Mark misunderstood Peter when he was telling the story. Or Peter didn't know the Bible that well, and so he just got it all wrong, but he's trying to make a point when he was trying to remember 30 years later what Jesus said, and he just got that wrong. That's one thing people say. Another thing people say is this. Truth is that in the Old Testament, they got it wrong. And Jesus is correcting everything right here because Jesus knew more about the story than anybody. So he's correcting it. Now, can I just say that all three of those answers just don't work very well? I have no idea. We can't worry about it because the details of the story is not what Jesus is getting to. Jesus is not getting, here's the deal. Jesus is not saying, I'm David and his men are my disciples. Okay? He's not saying that. He's not saying anything about that. This is an argument, and there's a name for it. I'm going to get it right. I'm going to look at it because it's in Latin. And where is it? Did you see that word in there? It's offertorio, I think is what it is. Is that what it is, Jeff? Did you see that? You didn't see it? What it means is this. If one person is really powerful and they can make a decision about the way the rules are going, if somebody who's more powerful than that person comes along, they can really make decisions about it. It's who's the most powerful. They get to make decisions based on who has the most power. David has the power and authority, because he's David, to decide that he can eat the showbread off the table and his men can eat it because it doesn't really say in the story that it never mentions the men except when he talks about them. So there may have been men, there may not have been men. It doesn't matter. He took the bread that nobody's supposed to eat and he ate it. And that was against the rules. And it's okay because he's David. And in that moment, David is never chided for it. There's no punishment for it. It never says in the text that he did the wrong thing. Nothing. None of that. He does it and the story just moves on. If he can do that, then Jesus can do what? He's way bigger than David. He's way bigger than David. So can you put the next text up for me? It says, then Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of the people. And what he's doing is he's going, okay, I'm gonna tell you the truth because I can. Bottom line is, I don't think he told his disciples, go ahead and eat that grain. Go ahead and do that. I don't think he ever did that. It makes no sense that he would have. He just didn't say anything when they did because it didn't matter to him. And not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. Now, this was not new with Jesus. If you read almost any commentary, they'll quote multiple places where other rabbis had said the same kind of thing earlier. The teaching was out there that, listen, the Sabbath was made for you, for people, to have a rest. The Sabbath was made to make us different than the rest of the world. And when the rest of the people in the world look at us, they will see that we are different, that we have an attitude about work and taking care of the land and taking care of one another and all kinds of things related to what you're supposed to do on the Sabbath that makes us different. And the rest of the world is supposed to see this and respond. I've been reading the most interesting book. Someone gave me, wasn't someone in this class? I don't think no, it wasn't. It was Meg Blevins. She's not here, is she? She gave me a book from the 1960s on the Jewish thought of man, the essence of man. It's a real interesting read because it actually reads like everything that we say that Grace Church is about. It's amazing, except that they don't believe in Jesus. But that being said, and there's a section in there about how God, it's talking about the origins of the Jewish faith and all this stuff, and it says right in there, the proof that God has been working through us to bring blessing on all of the nations of the world is that now the entire world functions under a 7-day week with at least 1 day of rest. Think about that. They're the hillbillies of the ancient world. They were. The small, meaningless nation who had a habit, a practice that nobody else in the world ever had, have influenced the entire mass of humanity. I mean, we've made it 2 days. You know, I had a professor at Capernwray who was really strong on the fact that the reason that the world is going to pot is because we're taking 2 days off on the weekend and we're only supposed to take 1. That being said, this thing. This is why Jesus said the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people. This is essentially what it says in the Greek. And now let's think about it. What they should have been doing, rather than figuring out 39 ways of work, is figuring out what are the needs of the people. What are the needs of the people? Not what are the requirements of the Sabbath. They went the wrong way. Why? Because they were so worried about not getting it right that God might punish them if they didn't get it right. They missed the heart of God in their fervor to be obedient. That's just a strange irony, is it not? Is it not? Now, Jesus was not saying anything that they probably hadn't heard before, but nobody had ever taken it seriously. Nobody had taken it seriously. You know, it calls me and makes me think about it. What are the needs of the people? It's an interesting concept before I go on about the Son of Man and that stuff. I'll just get into a little bit of Pauline. I just go out. Again, did I do that? I wonder if that's me. I don't know. I guess I'm back. Yep. When God finished work, he entered into his rest. And he's still resting. And that when we enter into the rest, we enter into Christ and we enter into his what? His rest. What does that mean? We're constantly in the rest of God. And we need to think about what are the needs of the people in that rest. This is like high level. What's the church about things? How do we relate to each other? Anyway. And Jesus says this. Now, if it had stopped right there, everybody going, okay, Rabbi, you're quoting the other rabbis from the past, and we get it, but nobody's really paying attention to that. But then he crosses the line. He says, so the Son of Man, calling himself the Son of Man, and I'm not sure they knew what he was talking about, but we know that he was referring to himself as that. I keep going in and out, don't I? Yeah. It's kind of psychedelic, actually. But so the Son of Man is Lord, even over the Sabbath. Now, Lord is a strong word. Kyrios, by the time, that's the word in Greek, by the time we get to the first readers of Mark, okay? Now, this would not have been the case when Jesus was saying this. But by the time we get to Mark writing, Caesar had demanded that the only person who could be referred to as Lord was him. Okay? The big fuss between the church, the early church, and the local constituencies of their towns was that the followers of Jesus, the Christians, referred to Jesus as Lord. That was treason. Now, when Jesus said this, he was not saying anything against Caesar at the time because no Caesar had yet declared himself to be Kyrios. But that being said, Jesus is not making a claim here of being, I mean, they could use this word at that time to like say, a great, like, I don't know, who can I pick out here? John. Okay, it's like if I'm going to show deference to John, I would refer to him as my Lord. Now, you've heard that phrase, like we still hear that like in medieval kinds of my Lord, that kind of thing. And it's what? It's a sign of honor to somebody. You could do it that way, or you could say that he is the Lord of, the Kyrios over this fact. They didn't have factories per se, but this place of work, or he's the Lord over these fields. You could use this kind of language to say that somebody had a position of what? Authority and respect. And so Jesus is going, the Son of Man is Lord. In other words, he has what? Authority, and he demands what? Respect as the one with authority. And then he says it even over the Sabbath. Now, This is he's not done anything wrong. His disciples have. He's getting blamed for the fact that they're picking the grain. But he doesn't say to them, think about this. He doesn't say to them, come on, guys. What they're doing isn't that bad. Come on, think about it. They're just picking a few pieces of grain. You guys have gone too far on this. He doesn't say that at all. What he said, his answer is, David could change the rules. And I'm bigger than David, and I'm changing the rules. He never once says, think about it this way. He just says, haven't you read? Which is a statement that, like, aren't you guys don't you get with the real program here? Haven't you ever thought this through? Haven't you read the Bible and figured out what's really going on here? Now, and what he makes is a strong claim, a huge claim, that he can tell you what the rules are. Now think about it. First he said that he can forgive sins. And then he said who deserves to get their sins forgiven. And then he's saying, then last week he said, what did he say last week? Something about new wine and, now he's saying, I can tell you what to do over one of the most revered, important rule system that you have, and that's over the Sabbath. I'm the Lord of it. And I deserve what? Respect, right? And honor, authority in the process. Now, this is big. This is big. We don't get any debate from anybody here. We don't get the next sentences. I do want to say this, though. There's been a process in these passages, in this hunk that we've talked about where Jesus is in Capernaum, he's meeting with people and doing things. At first, we ran into the Scribes. He ran into the Scribes. He had some trouble with them. They were kind of amazed, but they weren't sure about what to think of that. Then we run into the Scribes of the Pharisees. Right? Now, that's a little bit different. Now, we know there weren't a whole lot of Pharisees in Galilee at the time. Most of them were down in Judea and Jerusalem. But we got the Scribes of the Pharisees. So these are like professional law writers who are Pharisees. Now, we're just dealing with whom? The Pharisees. The next time we meet people who are going against Jesus, they're going to be the Pharisees and the Herodians of all people. And there's almost no way those two groups of people, we'll get into that in the next half of the class, would have ever had anything pretty much to do with each other. So it's a bad thing that's happening. It goes from sort of the surfacey level kind of guys that are not really sure about what Jesus is up to. And now he has stuck it in his finger in their chest. He didn't even give them an answer. He just said, I can tell them what to do. Don't mess with me because they're my disciples and I get to decide what happens on the Sabbath. Again, I don't know why those Pharisees were in the field with Jesus. But I can guarantee you that no matter how they went in, they came out with a completely different feeling about him. And it wasn't better. Okay. Now, just a couple of asides. The fact that this story takes place at the time when you could pull grain off of the plants and eat them tells us, and I said this earlier, it happened in late April or June. No, late April or May. Passover is earlier than that. Now, this is going to probably freak you out a little bit, but this is the only place in all of the Gospels where we get a timeline that tells us that Jesus was ministering for at least a year. Because none of it works out, because they're not really interested. The ancient writers were not really interested in chronological time, nor were they interested in putting their events into an ordered fashion that they actually happened. It's not chronological. Like, we don't know when any of this stuff happened when. But what we do know is that they were plucking grain and rubbing it in their hands and eating it, and that only happened at a certain time of the year, and it happened after Passover, and it's all the way to a Passover when Jesus gets crucified. So we know he was at it for at least a year. Now, almost all scholars believe he was at it for 3 years, that Jesus was ministering for 3 years. But different people come up with, some people say he was there for 5, some people say he was only there for 9 months. It's all over the map. We've pretty much believed 3 just based on when you put things together, but we don't know. But this is the one place in the Bible that tells us something that we can hang our hats on, that we can say he was doing this for a year. And one other thing, do you remember when I mentioned all the problems that we have in the Mark's gospel about the story between the Old Testament story and what Jesus says? When Matthew and Luke got around to writing this story out, we can tell that they used Mark as their guide because they left all the problems out. They left out the name of the priest. They left out the fact that he gave the bread to his friends and they ate it. They left out that Jesus went into the holy tent and the house of God. They leave all that stuff out. And just like they left out the fact that when they were pulling the grain, they were pulling the plant, they left it out. Nobody ever edits to make things more confusing. Mark would never have taken Matthew and said, he's not put in this stuff in here, so I'm going to stick a bunch of stuff in that I'm not really sure about. Or I don't have a copy of Samuel with me, so I'm just going to think about it and I'll just write in. So nobody does that. That shows us that Mark is first. Because when the other guys copied it, they go, we got some problems here. Problems in the Greek, problems in the storytelling. Let's just leave them out. That's wise. And another thing is this, and then we'll take a break. The fact that Mark has these things in it that are confusing, and the other Gospels have fixed them, tells us that you can be confident that nobody has messed with the text of Mark. Because if they were going to edit Mark later, they would have taken the confusions out. This is always something that when two Gospels say, like they're 2 blind men in one and 1 blind man in another story. They're the same story, but 2 or 1. Or one is 10 virgins and one is 5 in another gospel. The fact that they're different is something that we can all go, thank you, Lord. Because that means that nobody's messed with them to make them all look the same. If somebody was going to edit them and change them, they would make them the same so that they would be consistent through. But we can say to people when they go, well, in this book it says Jesus did this, and then you read the same story and there's like completely different details and they don't work out. And you can go, yes, and you know what? It's 2 people looking at the same car wreck and remembering it 30 years later, and nobody changed their witness of it. And so we know the texts are accurate. Different doesn't matter because the details are not what are important. The big message is what's important. And it does not matter whether Jesus got it right or wrong, or Mark got it right or wrong, or Peter got it right or wrong, or that their Greek was bad or what. It doesn't matter because we all know at the end of the day what? Jesus is Lord. And that was the point of putting this in here. To let us know that there were people who were offended by the fact that Jesus said, I have the authority to tell you what? That the Sabbath was made for the needs of people. Does this make sense? Let me read the next section. It's chapter 3. Yay. Jesus went into the synagogue again and noticed a man with a deformed hand. Since it was the Sabbath, Jesus' enemies watched him closely. If he healed the man's hand, they planned to accuse him of working on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the deformed hand, "Come and stand in front of everyone." Then he turned to his critics and asked, "Does the law permit good deeds on the Sabbath, or is it a day for doing evil? Is this a day to save life or destroy it?" But they wouldn't answer him. He looked around at them angrily and was deeply saddened by their hard hearts. Then he said to the man, "Hold out your hand." So the man held out his hand, and it was restored. And once the Pharisees went away and met with the supporters of Herod to plot how to kill Jesus. Okay, I'm not going to go too deeply into this. There's just so much to talk about. One thing I do want to tell you, a couple of things. The reason that just to give some background about this. When it says, Jesus said to the man, he literally said, "Rise up and come to the middle." So we'll talk about this now so I don't have to paint the picture next time. But synagogue worship, in the synagogues, the way they built them was that you had a front platform. It wasn't really a platform, but it was the front. And then on the side walls were stone benches, and then, there are benches on the sides. This is a big synagogue, man. That's big. That's really big. It's got a second floor with a balcony and everything. Anyway, they would see how these benches are here? In a place like Capernaum, it would have probably been a large single room and would have had benches on one side and benches on the other, and then a bench sort of halfway back. And men sat on the benches. Like in the round, and then other people sat or knelt on rugs on the floor in the middle, and then the women sat behind them. Or the women sat in a balcony up above them. But the women, they would stand to read in the front facing, then sit down with their backs to the crowd to discuss. This is why in Paul's letters he tells the women to because look, they're in the back and they can't hear what's going on anyway because people are talking about the passage forwards. They're talking like this, and the women are all in the back, and they can't hear what's going on, and so they all are doing what? They're talking about stuff. The whole town's together, and the ladies are in the back talking with the kids, all children under 13. And so he says, just be quiet, and go home and ask your husband what was talked about later when you get there. That's the reason that's why he says that. It has nothing to do with ecclesiological structure. It has to do with the fact that that was the way the thing was. And so I'll tell you this, and then this is probably a good place to stop. It says there's a man in the synagogue with a deformed hand. I'll probably repeat some of this next time. But the tense of the verb, it is not a verb, I'm sorry. It's a past participle. I think that's what it is. Is that what it is? Yeah. It reads as if it was something done to a past passive participle. That's the part I was missing. As if it was something that was done to him. Now, if it was, and so the effect of the language is that it had been that way all of his life. Okay, now, in the Gospel to the Hebrews and in Jerome, in the Gospel to the Hebrews is a non-canonical fragmented gospel that we have. The story is in it. Jerome comments about it as well. Both of them say the same thing, and probably Jerome got it from the Gospel of the Hebrews, but that this man was a stone worker, a plasterer who had been injured. And his hand had been injured and was dried up and unusable. And he'd actually come, these tell us that he'd come to Jesus before the synagogue service had started and asked to be healed because he could no longer work, and he had been forced to beg to feed his family. And now, this is not in this text, but this is an addition to this story which has a ring of truth to it. Why would somebody make up a story so specific and continue to tell it as part of this story in the oral tradition for so long? Now, I don't know whether this guy, the Greek makes it sound like he was born this way or he'd been this way a long time. If that's the case, then either he had sinned in the womb or his parents had sinned and this had happened to him. He could go to the synagogue, but he could never go to the temple. Right? If he had been this way all his life, he could only do that which he could do with one hand. He was a person who had a life that was less than everybody else. Now, I want you to think about this over the next week. Jesus says two things. He says, and I'll cover this, but I just want you to think about this. He says, is the Sabbath the time to do good or evil? Those words are the exact same words that are in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, when it talks about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He says, is it a time to give life to people or to give death to people, to kill people? The serpent's statement, Eve says, I'm not supposed to eat that because God says I won't die. And he says, no, what's going to happen is you're going to get life so big that you're going to be equal with God. So, his language, as this stuff goes on, we'll talk a lot more about it next time, is all really deep theological stuff that has an impact on a person who I'm sure he did not get hurt because if he was a stonemason, because he did it to himself on purpose. And he certainly, if he'd had it all his life, it is not true that he sinned in the womb. Does this make sense? And so we're getting into some really deep stuff, theological stuff here. But this is a powerful passage, and it's actually going to set the tone for the rest of Mark. Okay? So I'm going to stop there. I'll probably repeat some of that next time. But this is an important passage. It's a really important passage because Jesus is nailing some really important things. And he can do it because why? Because he is the Lord of the Sabbath. Okay? All righty. I'll see you next time.